Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it. I'd like to talk about a site that I worked on 3 years ago, right down along US 550, just south of the Coronado State Monument. And I've got a little PowerPoint I'd like to present with this. So I'll share my screen here. Okay, what I'd like to talk about is Mud Daubers, spiders, and the abandonment of LA 112420. It's an early developmental pit house site, as I said before, just south of the monument, Coronado State Monument, within the north right-of-way of US 550. The New Mexico Department of Transportation contracted with TRC Environmental Corporation to conduct data recovery at the site during July and August of 2017 for improvements. I'm sure for those who live in that area or going to the monument when they were working on expanding the bridge across the Rio Grande. It was associated with that project. Work was funded by the Federal Highway Administration and the New Mexico Department of Transportation. I'd like to give thanks to Blake Roxlow, Steve Lakatos, and Gwyneth Duncan at New Mexico DOT for their support and guidance on this project and coordination. And the following discussion from the title, you see the Mud Daubers, spiders, and abandonment concerns an unusual find from the site. And just as a warning, if anyone in the audience has either, I think pronounced this correctly, sexophobia or arachnophobia, now's your time to leave. I had to say that. So anyway, the site had been previously documented during several surveys as a surface scatter and two soil stains within the right-of-way. But upon the beginning of our excavations at the site, the two stains, which were originally recorded by several different organizations, firms, as isolated or separate, thought they were hearths, ended up merging, and they ended up becoming a single pit house that had burned. The location of this, you'll see there you see the Coronado State Monument in blue there, and I know it's kind of tiny, but the little red area, the site label, that's where our site is, immediately just south of the boundary of the monument and just west of the Rio Grande. The photo on the right there shows an aerial view, close-up of the site, showing our block excavation. The area in green is the pit house, and we had several other smaller block excavations. That building to the north there, that's, I haven't been up there for a while, but that's that new, it's not new now, it's a couple of years old, is that nice restaurant and brewery, microbrewery or whatever there. So we're just south of their property line between them and US 550, right, where the cars are shown there. Anyway, it turned into a burned pit house. And this is the main block excavation. The area in red is the outline of the pit house. And you can see the photo on the right there, the intense burning. The pit house had burned, so there were chunks of burnt wood, charcoal, a lot of burned adobe or burned earth associated with it. It had burned, and the entire roof had been earth covered, and so the entire roof had been subjected to intense heat, and so there were large chunks of the roof dirt that had burned as daub. Within the burned roof, in block number 35, where I've got, you see my little cursor there? In that block part of the roof, a Mud Daubers nest was collected that had been burned as the pit house burned. And I hope everyone's familiar with Mud Dauber nests. We see them quite frequently. And anyway, the nest had burned. when the pit house had burned, of course. And we showed the nest, the burned nest. That's what it looks like. And we showed that to our TRC biologist. And you notice there's the little linear conical cells that are opened up there from being broken open. Our biologist opened one of the cells that had not been opened during our excavation from just slight damage, whatever, and he found that there were spider remains inside it. And so that being the case, we contacted the entomologists in the Anthropology division of the Museum of Southwestern Biology at the University of New Mexico. Matthew Leister and Sandra Brantley examined the contents of the Mud Daubers cells that we had opened at TRC, and they requested permission to open several other of the Mud Dauber cells that were still intact. So Matthew Leister opened a couple of the other cells, and in those he found 26 distinct spiders within 3 of the other sealed cells. Of the 26 spiders, if you notice the scale on this, 5 millimeter and 2 millimeters, we're talking very small spiders here. And if you look real closely at the picture, you can actually see the baked hairs on the legs of those spiders and on their bodies. That's how well they are preserved. Perfect preservation. Matthew Leister was able to identify 10 crab spiders, 8 cobweb weaver type spiders, 1 running crab spider, and 1 orb weaver spider. And these are what they look like when they're alive. Before the wasps collect them and put them in their nests. One of the spiders, if you look on here, this photo, if you can see my cursor, you'll see some little eggs. See the little eggs there? The spider had actually laid some eggs while it was inside the Mud Daubers nest. So anyway, we were able to identify to genera and species that number of spiders. Unfortunately, these types of spiders have a wide range of habitats, and so we were unable to get really specific past environmental conditions at the time the pit house was occupied and burned. However, being carbon, one of the charged spiders is shown in the top left corner of this photo. It's provided by Beta Analytic, the place we sent the charcoal for radiocarbon dating. This particular spider was photographed by Beta Analytic, and this is what was used to get a radiocarbon date, an AMS, mass accelerators date on it. And our summary table here, the date for that spider is at the bottom. We got 3 things we radiocarbon dated at the site. The top sample was from feature 12. It was a hearth inside the pit house. Was a cupule from corn, and it yielded a date of 686 to 774 AD. And we also sent a kernel of corn to Beta for dating, and it yielded a date of 638 to 668 AD. And then at the very bottom of the table there is our spider, which has a range from 659 to 804 AD. And that's a confidence of 95% probability falling within one of those ranges. So anyway, we were able to actually date, get a radiocarbon date of the spider. These dates correspond with the ceramics and projectile point assemblages we recovered from the site. Just talk a little bit, if you're not familiar with the life cycle of Mud Dauber wasps, their larvae, pupae, and spider pack nests, then you're in luck, because I'll try to enlighten you a little bit on Mud Daubers here. I'll be real honest, I didn't know much about Mud Daubers until we did this project. And now I feel like I kind of intimately know the life cycle of Mud Daubers. Another warning here. If the following description I'm going to provide could be from an Edgar Allan Poe horror story, okay? There's two types of mud daubers, species that are most likely to have created or made this mud dauber's nest. One is the black and yellow mud dauber, or the blue mud dauber. And the blue mud dauber, shown here, tends to reuse nests built by other species of wasps. Both species are non-aggressive, and they're very common in a wide variety of habitats throughout much of the United States. Adult mud daubers feed on nectar and are active from the spring through the fall, usually mating in the spring or early summer, building their nests in the late summer or early fall, and hibernating during the cooler months of the year. So the life cycle of these is the female wasp working by herself. The males do not build the nests. The female mud dauber makes a nest in a sheltered location, and the nest usually consists of several parallel cylindrical mud cells, as we've seen in the previous slides. And the construction of the nest within the pit house means clay mud was readily available and probably closer than today's Rio Grande, which is currently present about 250 meters east of the site. We had a geologist or a geomorphologist, geologist on our site looking at our backhoe trenches that we cut across the site area. Steve Hall, I don't know if any of you know Steve, he's retired now, but he's worked for years and years with archaeologists in New Mexico and the Southwest in general. Anyway, he was our project geomorphologist, and he identified some clay lenses in the site's backhoe trenches that revealed that our pit house was built on the banks of an ephemeral stream that would have provided a very close source of water and clay during the rainy season. We're familiar with the rainy season right now, right? Once the cells, the mud dauber cells are constructed, the female wasp hunts for spiders, which she stings to paralyze them and brings them to the nest alive. She stuffs the first spider into an open cell and lays an egg on it. And I have a picture of it right here. There's a picture of one of the mud dauber eggs right there attached to a dead spider, or I should say a paralyzed spider. They're not dead, they're paralyzed. Then she continues to pack the cell with spiders one at a time, usually 3 or 9 spiders to a cell, before she seals it with mud. Then she abandons the nest once all the cells are provisioned and sealed. After the eggs hatch, the carnivorous larvae, which are shown in the bottom corner here, the little wormy looking things, larvae, feed on the paralyzed spiders. And the spiders are still alive, but they're paralyzed. And so they're eaten alive by the larvae until they're completely consumed. And then the larvae in the individual cells of the mud dauber's nest then spin cocoons and spend the winter as a pupae, as shown here in the bottom left-hand corner. And then in the spring, they emerge by chewing their way out of the mud dauber's nest. And under normal circumstances, the time between provisioning of the cell and the final consumption of the spiders by the larva can be about 10 days to 3 weeks. It's a very small window of opportunity to have preserved spiders in a mud dauber's nest. The presence of the spiders in the nest suggests that the pit house burned sometime during the late summer or early fall, soon after the nest was complete, and before or just after the wasp eggs had hatched. No mud dauber eggs, larvae, or pupae were identified among the charred cell contents, but all the spiders were still intact, 26 of them. Since the spiders are eaten alive, we wish to point out that their carbon-14 isotope had not yet begun to decay until the fire had killed them. Therefore, the AMS date obtained from the spider we submitted to Beta Analytic represents the most accurate date for the burning of the pit house. Those poor doomed spiders were either to be eaten or burned alive, and they essentially represent the literal expression out of the frying pan into the fire. Tying in the mud daubers and spiders to the archaeological context, you might be asking why we assume that the burned spiders date the end of the human occupation of the structure. And the answer relates to patterns of abandonment in the Southwest. There's the completed excavated pit house. You can see some interior hearth, and we also had interior post holes and so forth. And so as far as the abandonment of this pit house, first off, the informal construction technique and there was a lack of plastering or remodeling within the pit house, suggesting that it was occupied for a very short duration. However, the structure fits a pattern identified amongst ancestral Puebloan sites of purposefully burning dwellings upon their abandonment. In intentionally burned structures, the roof invariably collapses directly onto the floor with no other fill deposits between them, suggesting virtually no time elapsed between the final use of the pit house and its destruction or retirement by fire. Ethnographic accounts indicate burning is common due to either ritual requirements, sometimes in connection with the death of someone living in the pit house, or insect infestation. Mud daubers are not aggressive and don't build large hives for colonies as some other wasp species do. Furthermore, they tend to place their nests in out-of-the-way locations so as not to be disturbed. Therefore, one could argue that one small nest built by a solitary female mud dauber isn't really an infestation. We can't rule out the possibility of the perception of an infestation or a symbolic meaning to the wasp that would cause the people to abandon their pit house after such a short occupancy. On the other hand, the residents may not have even known the mud dauber nest was there. It may simply represent a case of what we call background fauna that just happened to be there and got preserved when the pit house burned and collapsed. So the question of insect infestation as the reason for abandonment remains ambiguous. Neither was there evidence of a burial associated with the pit house. So the reason why the people burned their structure, if it was intentionally burned upon abandonment, is unknown and unclear. Whatever the motivation for leaving the pit house behind, evidence of ritual abandonment is suggested. And I want to point out you have the outline of the pit house and the big yellow blob there that's got the number 37 in it. That's the entryway. It's facing kind of east, southeast, which is pretty typical pit houses for entryway orientation. And in this particular entryway, in excavation unit 37, there was a stack of artifacts that included two usable complete matatis, as shown in the photo at bottom right. You can see them stacked on top of each other there. And on top of them was a very nice complete obsidian arrow point, which is shown at the top photo. That was sitting inside or on top of the top matati. And all three of these objects were stacked together at the entrance of the pit house. Objects such as grinding slabs, pipes, stone bowls, and pottery vessels, projectile points were often deliberately placed within buildings in the Southwest for dedicatory or retirement offerings, often near the entrance of the structure before it would be ceremonially burned. The presence and location of the stacked artifacts at LA 112420, plus the collapsed roof lying directly on the sandy floor with very few or any other complete artifacts such as pots or anything. They'd been removed before it was burned. suggests a closing ceremony that resembles the intentional burning and abandonment ritual observed amongst ancestral and Puebloan pit structures. So in summary, trying to wrap this up, the structure at LA 112420 captured a rare moment in time. The discovery of the Mud Dauber nest at our site was a fortuitous event that beat tremendous odds. When you think about it, the number of wasp nests made in the past 1,100 years, probably in the hundreds of millions or billions, whatever. The number of burned pit houses are in the thousands that we know of. The number of wasp nests built in these pit houses, probably in the hundreds, maybe even the thousands. Wasp nests in archaeological context preserved and for current recovery from today's excavations. You know, looking in the literature, when we were doing this, our report, I looked for the recovery of Mud Daubers nests from sites, everything west of the Mississippi River. And there's less than 50 recorded Mud Dauber nests recovered from archaeological sites. And the next probability here, wasp nests with spiders inside them. From what our record searches can determine, there's less than 10 known probably in the entire US. And it's also at the very bottom of our little triangle here, as far as I know, this is the only site in the entire United States that has a radiocarbon date based upon a spider that dates 1,400 years old. This project provided the opportunity for rewarding collaboration between the fields of archaeology, entomology, and geology, geomorphology. And I'd like to thank my co-authors. This is a team effort. Co-authors at the University of New Mexico, entomology department, at TRC and the highway department, and our appreciation for the funding that made possible this unique and endeavor. And undoubtedly, this report will be known as the Spider Site and will hopefully be referenced for many years to come. For your reference, if you want to take notes here, I know this is being recorded, but you can get a copy of the entire report that we submitted to the Department of Transportation. It's a redacted report, so sites, location sensitive information has been removed, but it doesn't eliminate everything else that's in the report as far as the lithics, the fauna, the ceramics, the phytoliths, the pollen, all of the other special studies that we had done for this project. So I encourage you to go to the website shown here, and you can download for free from the Department of Transportation's website. There's other reports there as well, and I encourage you to do so. And that's, I'll end it there. Thank you very much.
We'll open it up for questions now. So go right ahead and ask questions if you'd like.
I'm curious, what is left of the site? Has it been filled in? And
that's a good question. There is nothing remaining of the portion of the site within the highway right of way.
okay.
We removed everything that was there. The site undoubtedly extends farther north onto private land where that restaurant, where the parking lot and so forth is for that restaurant and microbrewery, whatever that's there now. One of the things that was that was missing during our excavations is there were no extramural features. There's no features outside the pit house. There were no storage pits. There were no hearths, nothing outside the structural boundaries itself. And one of the things we considered is that when they built US 550, which is very close to the front or the entrance to the pit house, they're probably when that highway was put in, they probably removed any extramural features that were associated with the pit house at that time. It's still interesting, there weren't any to the sides of it or to the back of it. But like I say, to the north of it, the site undoubtedly extends farther north, and it is disturbed area. Whether there's anything preserved much, that's undetermined. But the pit house, the north part of our pit house was a good 50 centimeters below the surface. So there's a very good chance there's other remains of the site on private land.
I have a question. Was Kuaua occupied at this time?
I don't know, you're more familiar with that than I am. I'm trying to remember. We're talking around 750, 800 AD here.
Kuaua's earliest dates are around 1300, I believe.
Yeah, it's like P4, P3. So this would predate it. And there's several sites between this site and the monument site.
Were there other pit houses in the same vicinity?
If they were, they've been removed, or they're still buried on private land outside the highway right-of-way. We'll never know.
I want to ask, you said that when you went into the literature to find out how many other mud dauber sites had been found, and I was surprised at that. What other kinds of sort of entomological and things are found in these cultural resource investigations?
Okay, actually there's a whole subfield specialty of entomological archaeology. People that focus on the insects and spiders, and since spiders aren't really insects. But anyway, insects, spiders and wasps and so forth. Anyway, there's the whole specialty of entomological archaeology. I'm not real familiar. I don't even know anyone in particular that specializes as an archaeologist in that field. You could probably count them on one hand in the country. There's not very many of them. But when I mentioned those other 50 or so mud dauber nests recovered from archaeological contexts west of the Mississippi, as far as none of them had preserved spiders in them. We're the only site that had actually carbonized spiders. And I was trying to emphasize in my talk, I said those spiders are packed in those cells, and then the wasps, they lay their eggs and seal it up. And there's only about a 10-day to 3-week window that would preserve spiders like that. Otherwise, they're eaten up by the larvae of the wasp. So it's a real small window to preserve something like that. And on this particular case, everything was working for us for the preservation of that mud dauber.
The next one was going to be whether there was any cultural significance found of any of them, like were they beekeepers or bug keepers of any kind?
No, there's no evidence of that. This was just, mud daubers, it just happened to build a nest up probably in the ceiling of the pit house in some dark corner of it. And the occupants of the pit house most likely didn't even know it was there.
Right.
Because these mud daubers, they're not aggressive. They try to avoid people.
That's just fascinating that that these kinds of tiny little bits of evidence, 100 years ago might have just been overlooked entirely, except that now you have this multidisciplinary approach, and it's wonderful to hear about what you're gleaning from all of that.
Yeah, I've been doing archaeology. This is my 47th year, and there's been a lot of changes, especially in the technology, in all respects, both in the micro end of it, like with the spiders, the entomological end of it, the small things, and of course, sure some of you, or if not all of you, are familiar with LIDAR. LIDAR has really revolutionized the discovery of hidden structures and stuff in dense tropical rainforests and so forth. So anyhow, a lot of changes in the last several decades.
Isn't there a new technology that's that seems like LiDAR, except you're just looking in the ground, and it can tell differences in the ground itself, and notice squarish or roundish things that are not natural.
Yes, remote. One of the remote sensings is ground penetrating radar, what we call GPR for short. And that's been around for a number of years. And resistivity picks up metal objects, and of course deep penetration metal detection. In fact, a project that we worked on for the city of Albuquerque about 4 years ago, it was down at the railroad yards, downtown Albuquerque, where the abandoned maintenance yards and the big turntable and so forth is, just east of downtown Albuquerque. That's a historic district, and the city hired us to do some exploratory research to find out if there was any remains of the earliest railroad construction, which would have been built in 1880 when the first railroad came in. And we are actually able to find the 1903 buried turntable. It's intact out there in the parking lot. We found the roundhouse dating to the late 1800s. So yeah, if you want me back sometime, I'll talk about that site. Anyway, we used remote sensing on that, ground penetrating radar and resistivity, to find buried, in this case, historic remains. And yes, it's not like Hollywood, it's not like Jurassic Park where the little skeleton pops up on the screen. That's Hollywood. That's make-believe, okay? That's not what ground penetrating radar results look like, but you do find stuff.
So could you use that if you were able to go into the campground area, which is just north of where your site was? Could you use ground penetrating radar to find more pit houses, or is there just not enough to distinguish?
I'm sure we could, or if the landowner, if someone was willing to finance it and the landowner allowed it, that would be an excellent attempt to, it'd be probably a combination of GPR and resistivity, and maybe looking for prehistoric, we probably wouldn't use metal detection, but the resistivity, that would find ground disturbed areas. So pit houses would pop up, burials, human burial remains would pop up, would be detected. I shouldn't say pop up, they'd be detected in the results of those surveys.
Well, thank you.
I mean, I've done some other kinds of contract work, but not in archaeology. But because you went into, you did so much interdisciplinary things and had to keep getting new specialists, I would say that you must have had a very willing funder to let you keep expanding your needs for analysis. That was what's so amazing to me, that you could go do that much.
That's why we thank the highway department.
Yeah, really, that is amazing to get that kind of funding. And I mean, there's probably stuff lying around everywhere, mud dauber nests and things that people just didn't have enough funds to continue with any more analysis with what they found.
But like I was saying, this mud dauber, as it turns out, because of the preservation, it's extremely rare.
Yeah.
To have something like that preserved. Fortunately, the people we dealt with are archaeologists at New Mexico Department of Transportation, and so they have a curiosity as well as to pursue some of this.
Yeah, and they do a lot of cultural resource stuff.
Wow, really fascinating stuff.
If you want to see the whole report, you can download it for free.
Yeah,
it's about 400 pages. You got all of this, if you're into ceramics or fauna or lithics, groundstone, flakestone, geomorphology, phytoliths, pollen,
wow,
starch, protein residue. We went into all that.
Can you tell us something about those other disciplines, like what you found, like protein residue and things like that?
Okay, well, let's see. Where should I start? The groundstone, of course, you saw the photos of the metates and the arrow point at the in the entryway to the pit house. Those were our best preserved groundstone, but we found a number of broken groundstone. It's oftentimes used for hearthstones around their fires for cooking. If they break the, the matadi or monos, whatever. We did find a clay pipe, smoking pipe. It's a cylindrical pipe. And I'm trying to remember, I'm pretty certain we sent in residue from the contents of the pipe to get starch and maybe protein residue, but I don't recall offhand what the results were.
No DNA.
That. But we did get a smoking pipe. It's perfectly preserved and intact. One of the more interesting pieces of ceramics. It's a ceramic pipe. The ceramics are, I don't know if you know Mike Marshall or not, Cibola Research. He did our ceramic analysis, and the ceramics are very typical of early Puebloan occupations of that time period, 800 AD. There weren't any surprises there. There was a thin scatter, I should say a thin presence of later ceramics contemporaneous with the occupations of farther north of there on the Coronado State Monument, dating to the 1400s. So, but there's only like 20 or 30 sherds. That was it. And they were right below, they were either on the surface or right below the surface where you might expect them. They were not directly associated with the pit house. The starch residues, usually we send in brownstone and we send in some chipstone bifaces for starch and phytolus residues. And that gave us some information on the plants, particularly the botanical environment. And as you might suspect, we're right on the west edge of the Rio Grande Valley there, right at the base of the mesa. And so we're finding, as far as botanical remains go, and that's based on pollen, phytolus, and starch and protein residues. Well, not protein, starch, pollen, and phytolus. Kind of a mixture of both riverine aquatic species, which are coming out of the Rio Grande Valley itself, the riparian environments there, and we're getting some species further west up on the mesa that are adapted to more xeric, drier environments. So this site was ideally located to harvest botanical resources, both from the river, the floodplain, riparian, and also the edge of the mesa. There is just 3 or 4 major species of grasses, primarily, commonly referred to as Indian rice grass, and wild barley. Wild barley shows up a lot on these sites. I know we got some from this site. So fauna, unfortunately, the faunal remains were pretty limited, and it was pretty much restricted to the smaller critters, the lagomorphs, i.e. the jackrabbits, cottontails. Nothing large was in the assemblage. There's some of the chunks of bone probably were from like deer size critters. There is no evidence of anything larger like elk or bison or anything like that. So the fauna, and that's not unusual for sites like this. Unfortunately, we're in a dunal environment. We're in sand dunes, and preservation of fauna is oftentimes, unless the conditions are perfectly good, fauna remains are not real well preserved.
Did you find any things like you'd expect them living along the river, that there would be turtle shells or those kind of things? Did you find any of that sort of stuff?
I don't recall finding any turtle. One of the things we were expecting to find maybe would be fish. And as I recall, we did not find any fish, which is kind of unexpected. Because working on sites, particularly later sites contemporaneous with the monument, 1400s, and at the time of Spanish contact. It's those larger pueblos later on where you have a lot larger population density, a lot larger room blocks and higher population in some of those communities. They were doing a lot of fishing, and it's just from our own one of my specialties is faunal analysis, identification and environmental interpretation of faunal remains. And I know working on a site dating to the 1400s, actually a little later, clear up into the 1600s, down in Los Lunas for a highway project. This was like 27 years ago. And we were finding large quantities of fish, particularly freshwater drum and catfish. And some of these fish, based on the size of their skeletal elements, some of those catfish and particularly some of the catfish they were at least 100-pound catfish. They were huge. And so that gives you an idea how much water used to flow in the Rio Grande 400 years ago, 500 years ago, before we started pulling it out for irrigation and reservoirs. At that time, in ancestral Puebloan development, they might have had a taboo against eating fish. Like the Navajo, there's certain fish. In fact, the Navajo normally don't eat fish. A lot of societies do not eat catfish because catfish are bottom feeders, and they're considered trash fish because they feed off the bottom of the the rivers, whatever. They eat the dregs of other animals, so to speak. And so they're considered taboo. And so you don't find them in archaeological context. It depends, the society, what their beliefs are and norms are, and what's considered taboos and what's acceptable or not acceptable. In this case, in diet.
Appreciate your talk. I learned a lot today. Appreciate it a lot. I never know what these smaller sites and the sort of intense investigation that you guys do, what kind of amazing amount of information you get. 400 pages is a lot.